You all for being here. This is the fifth webinar in our Aerospace Human Factors webinar series that the HFES ASTG is running. Today we have Jenny O'Donnell as our guest. She's the Director of Systemic Factors Limited. I will let her introduce herself. But as always, I'm Rodrigo. I'm a volunteer with the ASTG and I run these webinars. If you are interested in participating in a webinar like this, or if you know somebody who you think would be a good guest for one of these webinars, please reach out to me. We're always looking for more people to participate. With no further ado, Jenny, take it away.
Thank you so much. Absolute pleasure to be here, and thank you for asking me to do this webinar. Just before I start, as we're on the subject of safety investigation, one really important skill for safety investigators is the power of observation. So I'm going to ask all of you, whether you have your camera on or not, is there anything of interest you might have noticed about this initial slide? And answers in the chat box, or you could open the microphone. And if you say it's not particularly interesting, that's also absolutely fine. So over to you, answers in the chat box, or you can open your microphone. Yes, Neil, you get the first, you get the top prize for the fastest answer. Yeah, I'm titled Lady. Now, in the UK, you can, many people, not many people, but there's royal families and there's land that's owned by royalty, and you get a title of Lord or Lady if you own some of this land. What they started doing about 10, maybe 15 years ago is selling off tiny pieces of this land, about a centimetre, square centimetre. And I was given one of these as a gift, and it was about 60 bucks. And I can now legally use this title. So if you're looking for an inspirational gift for a friend, you don't even have to live in the United Kingdom. You can legally buy one of these titles and use them. And I will use mine often, and I might go to a hotel. So I tried this in Spain not long ago, and I said, oh, hello, it's Lady Jenny, may I have a nicer room? And I actually got an upgrade. It works with hotels and restaurants. So just this top tip for you there, that's absolutely nothing to do with safety investigation, with the exception of it's related to observation. So other than being a lady, for the very observant amongst you, you might also notice my initials are J-Lo. I have nothing else in common with Jennifer Lopez, very sadly, other than my first name, Jen, or Jennifer here. And the reason I'm here to do this session with you is that I'm a safety investigator. I started life as a systems engineer back in the 90s. I did aeronautical engineering and then became chartered in the early noughties. And from the age of about 13 or 14, I always knew that I wanted to be an air accident investigator. So I've had various experience with very near misses, with multiple fatal accidents and various different things. And I've noticed over the years that the way I was initially trained back in the naughty 90s, that things probably weren't as good as they are now. So we've really moved on. Maybe the focus isn't, always right, but often the focus when it's on the human and not the wider system, we can miss the point, and it really isn't great for trying to really truly prevent what we want to prevent in future, preventing further harm, preventing further damage. So in this session, I'm going to talk to you about systems-based approach for safety investigations. And because I'm so obsessed with system-based approaches as a human factors practitioner, I named my company after that. So I try very much to look at the systemic factors that influence why people do what they do. And that could be in everyday decision-making through to when we look retrospectively through the lens of safety investigations. Now, if I may, I'm going to take you back 21 years to an accident that I was the lead investigator in the factory side of things at British Aerospace, or what became BAE Systems. It was a Jetstream aircraft. There were 15 on board, and very sadly, 13 on board perished. Now, I'm just going to send this out with a little bit of a warning that the footage here is a reconstruction. They turned this into a National Geographic program a couple of years back. So the footage is actually quite accurate as a reconstruction of what occurred. You don't have to watch this. If you're feeling sad or a bit down, please feel free to turn your cameras off, and you don't have to watch, but it's just coming with a bit of a warning because it is a crash sequence. But what I want you to think about as this is playing is why. This is why we do what we do as investigators. We want to understand why, so we can try and minimize the likelihood of it happening again. And one of my takeaways from doing investigations, certainly in my earlier days, is that focus on human failure thinking kills, and it doesn't prevent harm in future when we're just obsessed with that individual human or those humans who failed without looking at the deeper reasons why. So I shall play this video now. It's not mandatory watching, of course, and nor is this session, but hopefully some of you will find this interesting, those of you who are able to watch it. So there's no sound. So this was a flight back in October 2004, and on approach to Kirksville, Missouri. As I mentioned, there were 15 on board, 13 sadly perished. It was a controlled flight into terrain case where they really sadly hit trees, which we'll just see now. So apologies that that's not the nicest way to start a presentation, but very sadly, this is real life. Now, for us as investigators, what was interesting at the time was that we had a strong feeling that fatigue was at play in this particular case. And the investigator in charge, because this happened in the States, although the aircraft was designed and manufactured in the United Kingdom, because the state of occurrence was the US, it was the NTSB, the National Transport Safety Board, who headed up the investigation. And as technical advisors to this investigation, they wanted us to come up with a probable cause statement. And I wrote the report from the BA systems side of things. And I struggled with this a little bit because I thought, how can I distill this into one singular cause or one probable cause? And I really felt that fatigue was at play. So the investigator in charge said, okay, well, you need to demonstrate this. How can you prove this? And unfortunately, the crew had died. But with the NTSB public docket, we were able to open up and see some really useful information. So from family members of the crew, there was a discussion about how they called home in the morning and said they hadn't slept so well, they had disturbed sleep in the hotel. From colleagues of the crew members, they saw them napping in between sectors in the crew room. They'd been flying several sectors, if I remember rightly, 6 sectors in one day with no autopilot in marginal weather. Their workload was high. And one of the critical things for us was that at the point of impact, they'd been on duty nearly 15 hours. And in many other parts of the world, that flight would have been illegal in Europe at the time, in Canada and in Australia. So we had a strong suspicion that we could never prove, but that fatigue was at play. But I want to open this up to you now. What do you think the probable cause was written up as? So we wrote our report, passed it to the National Transport Safety Board. Have a guess, open the chat box, open your microphones if you want to. What do you think the NTSB might have suggested the probable cause was? And Catherine's bang on it, yeah. Pilot error. In not so many words, you know, they use or more words than that. So pilot error, human error. And this is, yes, whilst it's true, it was human error, but there was a lot more to it. So thank you, Viviana and Catherine. I hope I've read both of your names right. Sometimes I struggle with my reading. So these were the probable causes. Not human error, I suppose, can be described in lots of different ways, but failure to follow procedures is another way of saying it. Now, that tells you what happened and not why. If someone's failed to do something, why have they failed to follow those procedures? What was wrong with those procedures in the first place? One of the other probable causes in this case was that they failed to adhere to established division of duties between pilots. Again, whilst all of this is true, why were these failures happening? And without thoroughly answering the why and having this front and center in our causal statements, the same thing can potentially happen again. And then another line, failure to make standard call-outs. Now, I'm not criticizing any of the NTSB team at all here. I'm just saying that sometimes if the focus, particularly in probable causes, is around the failure and not the mechanisms underlying it, such as fatigue or flight time limitations and this type of thing, we can miss some things. And the NTSB did do a good job of explaining how fatigue was at play or a likely contributor. But sadly, it wasn't enough to stop the next accident, which we believe really had a strong, a strong relationship to fatigue being at play here. So this little slide I'm showing you now is 5 years on. So the Kirksville, Missouri accident, jet stream accident, was 2004. 5 years later, the Colgan Air crash occurred, and this didn't just kill everyone on board this time, but it killed an occupant of a house on the ground. And the NTSB on this occasion, in their final report, were very much stronger and clearer that both the captain and the first officer were most likely fatigued at the time, but they couldn't at the time determine how much that had degraded their performance. Really sadly, for me as an investigator, I didn't have anything to do with the Colgan Air case at all. But for me as an investigator, whenever I hear that there's still crews dying or people dying around the world where it's been influenced by fatigue, I find that so sad, because we had clear evidence back in 2004 that fatigue and flight time limitations just weren't strong enough. The great news is now we've moved on from that. And after this accident, 2009, the flight time limitations were changed and improved. So I think the focus sometimes, when we're focusing too much on the failure of the human and not looking at the underlying controls to protect the human or protect the asset or protect the environment, when they're not robust enough, these things can keep occurring and keep occurring. And sometimes we can come up with too much of a focus on human failure language. So I'm just going to ask for a show of hands if you've seen any of these types of phrases before. So poor teamwork, show of hands if you've ever heard of poor teamwork as a cause, or you could just raise electronic hands or put it up here. So a few of you have. Um, Poor teamwork though, what does that mean? Does it mean poor communication? Is it poor leadership? Is it unclear objectives? Is it just disagreements in the team because there's, breakdowns? What does it mean? So sometimes this is very unclear and doesn't help us. Often the question is asked who was involved rather than, well, what happened and why? Who did it? Failure to follow procedure, we still see all over the place without explaining how fit for purpose those procedures were. I still see, when I audit safety investigation reports, I still see a lot of the supervisor failed. I still see a lot of inadequate risk assessment, but at the time, the risk assessment was believed to be adequate for those people doing that job. It's a bit like saying their crystal ball failed. So sometimes these feel really unfair, particularly when the risk assessment is a poor protocol or a poor standardized 5x5 matrix that doesn't really help a great deal, doesn't look at the controls very well. This one is an interesting one, loss of situational awareness. Show of hands if you've ever come across loss of situational awareness, either in a report or you've heard of this. Excuse me. What's interesting about this to me is that it's not like your phone, is it, where your cell phone, you can just lose that for 20 minutes or something, or you can lose a coin. This is 3 levels, and as fabulous human factors people, you'll know this, that human situational awareness, to the original definition of Ensley, is 3 levels. It's level 1, perception. It's level 2, comprehension, and level 3, projection. In other words, it's understanding what, so what, and then now what. And so when we might see or read in an investigation report that there's loss of situational awareness, invariably, certainly from what I've read and experienced, it doesn't go into the depth needed to talk about whether it was perception, comprehension, or projection that was affected. So these labels, I don't think, really help us understand the system and the controls that maybe have been impaired or failed and led the human to this situation. Complacency, really interesting one here. Show of hands if you've come across complacency before. Often used in aviation maintenance, the dirty dozen. We see this a lot in aircraft hangars, and it's promoted as a way of thinking of human factors that may affect us and this type of thing. So actually, we want to really think about, well, what drives complacency? And if any of you here, I'm sure, despite your education, your background, your focus on human factors, I'm sure any of us here would suffer with reduced vigilance if we were to do a task that was monotonous and rather dull. So, for example, if you were going to do an inspection of all of the rivet heads on an A380 wing skin, after a while, our vigilance would drop down. And so this is largely down to the task design. Instead of saying simply inspect the 500 rivet heads on the upper wing skin. Instead, we can make the task fit for purpose for the human and break it down into stages. A bit like saying, oh, simply inspect all of the life jackets on board a 747. Wow, a lot of life jackets to inspect there. Check the seal, check the lights, check the whistles. A lot to do there, and quite boring after you've done number 10. So breaking tasks down, making task design fit for purpose, I think can help us overcome complacency. Complacency, as the fabulous Todd Conklin often says, is a symptom of a stable system. It's the reason why, and I'll ask you to raise your hands again. Have any of you ever driven somewhere and it's a regular route you take and you think, oh, how did I get here? Show of hands if that's happened to you, or is that just me in the UK? Because it's happened to some of us. Again, complacency is a symptom of a stable system. So I'm just catching up with things in the chat box here. Hate is a blame statement. All of the who questions, as well as many of these other instances, seem to come back to a desire to want to assign specific blame to individuals rather than identify the actual whys at play so they can work to address them in the future. Yeah, wise words. Yeah, Catherine and Neil completely agree with you there. I feel it drives the real underlying reasons under the carpet, and it does nothing really to prevent things happening in future. That's why we need a more systems-based approach. Root cause. This is interesting. I see this a lot in investigations. Root cause as intended is thinking about maybe a beautiful oak tree. A beautiful oak tree has many levels of roots. They're multifaceted, they're different, they're complex. Commonly, when I see a root cause analysis, I'll see a singular cause assigned, as if the root is like a carrot or a root vegetable. Just one comes out. Actually, the intention of real root cause is to have a look at all those different levels, different ways in which something can have influenced in this case. Unfortunately, root cause has been hijacked, and we often hear the root cause. And then one of my ultimate favorites, I often see this, it's a human factors problem. It's down to the human factors. And what they mean is it's down to the human and it's down to human error. So with this in mind, one thing that I often explore, and I do this with aerospace investigators, be they engineers, be they pilots, be they air traffic controllers or ground handler investigators, we try and explore real human factors because it helps us overcome those labels. Labels are for clothes and not for people. And often I say to them, what is human factors to you? And they say, oh, it's just about people. But of course, it's more than just that. Human factors and real human factors is ergonomics. It's cognitive, what goes on in our thoughts based on how we're influenced based on everything around us. It's the physical ergonomics and it's the organizational ergonomics. Human factors and ergonomics are one and the same. And ultimately, as many of you will know, it's about improving the design of everything we interact with, from a printout of data through to a procedure, through to an environment, through to a fuel pump, through to a jetway, an air bridge, or an air traffic control console. It's about improving that design of all those system elements so we can improve human well-being and system performance. And this is my or our little take on what has been around for a while now, the 2000 definition from the International Ergonomics Association. In a nutshell, it's, as you know, it's about designing for people to make things safer and to make things easier, and safer. When we think about human factors properly, it helps us overcome this old view of human factors, which is that complex systems are basically perfectly safe and that humans are just unreliable and they make shortcuts and they just ignore rules and all this type of thing. And actually, all we need to do is give people a reminder to be more careful, or a reminder to follow the procedure, or a reminder to follow that reminder, and more supervision and more rules. But what they don't do is look at the underlying issues in the system. And tragically, this ends up with a focus too much on human error, seen as the cause, and either they're retrained just for retraining's sake, or they're then disciplined. Now, the problem with this approach is the same things keep happening. We get damaged kit, damaged people. They feel blamed. They don't want to come back to work, or they feel that they've lost confidence. They feel that they can't do the task now because they've had the finger pointed at them. It leads to more waste and more cost because we don't fix the underlying issues in there. Also, more fear, less trust, less speaking up, and just culture is kicked psychological safety is shot. Now, moving on to more positive ways of thinking about the system and investigations, I think this is quite a useful little video here. So this is a runaway ground car, as you can see here. It's got a mind of its own. It's
Hit the
spinning round
airplane.
and
Here it
round,
goes.
very close to this beautiful aircraft.
That's how you do it.
Now, that will have been in no manual anywhere to do this, to say, right, take your vehicle and move it. But the thing that we have with real human factors is moving away from the old approach to human error, is thinking about actually human beings will try and create safety every day. There isn't a procedure for every little thing that we do. And we're obsessed, I think, with procedures based on the assumption those procedures are perfect and they're well written and they've been written by those people that do the job. And that's not always the case. I must hold my hands up. I've written a procedure on how to replace a A380 fuel pump, having never ever done that myself. But it was a request that I had to do a task like that, to write the procedure. And you can imagine how that procedure went down. Because I'd never done the task. I've changed fuel pumps before, but never on a 380. So procedures are not always perfect. And actually, humans create safety every day. Like we just saw in that video there. Complex systems are never going to be 100% safe. There's no such thing as 100% safety. There is risk in everything. There's risk in just being alive. And complex systems are ultimately trade-offs. We're always trying to be as safe as possible, but we know there's time limitations, there's resource limitations. So knowing that there's all these complexities and issues, we need to focus and realize that human error is a symptom of what lies in the system. So human error exists. It's everywhere around us, but often it is a symptom of what lies in the system. And when we think about a system has a few elements. So anything can be a system in terms of if it has a purpose, if it has elements, and if there are interconnections with those elements. So you could think of, if you like, your digestive system. You've got your teeth, your tongue, your salivary amylase, your stomach, and so on. You could think of a maintenance system for aircraft. You could think of a design system. So it has a purpose, it has elements, and it has interconnections. And the beautiful thing about systems thinking is it shifts our thinking from who failed to what failed in the system and why it failed. It helps us focus on what the world looked like for that person at the time and how good were the system elements around them, how good was their training, how good was the equipment they were using, where was their focus of attention of the time and why, and was that to do with the task and their familiarity of the task or the monotony or complexity of the task. With this in mind, it helps us explore something that's really pivotal for systems thinking and investigation. And it's called the local rationality principle. Now, if you've never heard of this before, please Google this now. Other search engines are available, and have a look at what this is and put your answers in the chat box. Or if you already know, type your answers in the chat box. Just catching up with these, yeah, loving these comments. But yeah, ban complacency means automaticity. Yeah, I love this. Yeah, human factors equals ergonomics. Oh yeah, Neil, completely. It's not just US. It's absolutely, there's the ergonomics is seen as a subset of human factors in some quarters in the UK and Europe and Australia. And it's, if we go to the proper definitions, we know that's not quite right. They're one and the same. So local rationality, what is it? This is our challenge, because this is one of the most important factors of human factors in investigations. And Andrew said, users do what makes sense to them at the time. And you try to make the best decision at the moment. Yeah, I'm loving these definitions. Thank you. These are absolutely spot on and far more eloquent than what I come up with. But here's a little version of mine. Local rationality principle is AKA why something made sense at the time. Faced with 3 different avenues to go down 3 different tunnels, we base our decisions on the information we have at the time, our focus of attention at the time, and our knowledge at the time. How well educated were we for this? What clues and signs and symptoms did we have to know that this was the right path or the wrong path? So trying to get ourselves back into the situation where that person found themselves is really, really useful. And the local rationality principle is beautiful because it helps us think about that person in the system. And on that note, related to this, a systems thinking question can help us. Now, there's lots of different systems thinking methodologies out there. There's lots of safety analysis, different methods out there. We could talk about these all day. What I found in my workshops and working with different investigators, particularly new investigators, and I found this myself, is that sometimes there's such a lot of complexity in the analysis methods we use that it makes it hard to then do the job of investigation and then to explain things to families who've lost loved ones or to fellow colleagues who are engineers, pilots, air traffickers, or whoever. So this system thinking question was inspired by someone who is a professor of healthcare. And we've adapted this to a question called CP test. And for any problem solving, and I'm literally mean anything that you're thinking about, whether you're planning some new research, whether you're thinking about maybe moving to a new apartment or something that's happened in work, maybe with a challenge with a colleague or something like this systems question can hopefully be useful. The initials to help us remember it is CP test, which stands for conditions, person, task, equipment, standards, and training. I'll just run you through it. So the question is this: under these conditions, can this person or these people do this task using this equipment to these standards with this training? CP test. Can this, under these conditions, can this person or these people do this task using this equipment to these standards with this training? And a systems-based approach would also ask of these conditions, be they the organizational conditions or the physical conditions or the external conditions that have come from economic influencers or regulators or whatever. One of the key things to ask is, with any of these elements, the conditions or the task design or the equipment or the training, is FFP. When we engage with people, we can ask how far something, sorry, another acronym for you here, how far was something fit for purpose in the eyes of the user? So back in the 90s, I used to say, oh, you've had training, fantastic. I've looked at the spreadsheet, I can see you've had your training. Now instead, I'll say, talk me through your training. Tell me what that training was like so I can understand it. Now, I won't go into all the detail that's surrounding all this, but within these buckets, there's lots of sort of things that we can think of to prompt our questions, to prompt our thoughts about how good were the tasks. Was it difficult? Was it complex? That kind of thing. What was the equipment like? What was the layout like? And all this type of thing. Under standards, we've got things like policies, procedures. So rather than saying they failed to follow procedures, we can now, with a systems-based approach, ask richer questions. Tell me how fit for purpose the policy was. Tell me how readable or accessible that procedure was. Tell me how far it was illustrated in a way that helped and aided your understanding to do this task. So whoever we're engaging with, whether that's design engineers through to mechanics, through to ground handlers, baggage handlers, whoever, we can ask richer questions with a systems-based approach. We can also do the same of training as well. Now, to ask any of these things, in a nutshell, we want to ask, how far were these things fit for purpose? And a way of doing this is to ask with humble inquiry, tell me about your thoughts on this. Tell me about the task that you were doing. Tell me about the equipment you were using. Talk me through how fit for purpose it was. And by using this approach with a humble inquiry perspective, rather than being, I'm an investigator and I'm here to be harsh and judge you, we are not there to judge. We are respectful, or should be respectful, of those people who were involved. They were there, and as investigators, we weren't. Even if they've done a job that I've done before, I wasn't there that night on that shift in the situation they found themselves in. So as investigators, we need to be humble and we need to explore things with that humble inquiry and openness, open questions. And open questions can start with things like this: TED T, tell me, explain, describe, talk me through. Questions that start like this are not just useful for us as investigators to explore those system elements, but they can be great when we're on a taxi ride, we're riding in a cab somewhere. And rather than just trying to start a conversation with a cab driver, how's your day been? We can say, tell me about your day. Tell me about the most interesting, or tell me about the most famous person you've had in the cab. You're probably thinking, what's this got to do with investigation? It's got nothing to do with investigation, but I often say to investigators, the more of these type of questions we use in our everyday life, the easier it is for us to do it in our actual practice when we're interviewing people with a systems-based approach. The more we try this out in a supermarket when we're, not in an automated checkout, it has a really strong practice effect. It moves us away from, did you see the light? Through to, talk me through what you remember seeing. Describe the lights to me. This type of thing gives a much richer understanding for us as investigators and tells us more about the system that we can then explore. You've mentioned the lights. Tell me more about the lights, this type of thing. So this, coupled with a systems-based approach, the CP test, under these conditions, can this person do this task using this equipment with these standards, with this training? We can really have a much clearer understanding of what their world looked like at the time and why their decisions made sense at the time. All of this moves us away from an obsession with human failure thinking, which we know does nothing to prevent future occurrence and doesn't really stop the next person getting hurt. So this is one of the key things in here. So just summing up then, top tips for better investigations. Use CP tests throughout, thinking about how we can learn about the system with this acronym. Under these conditions, can this person do this task using this equipment to these standards with this training? And asking people to tell you more about those different elements can really give you a much wider understanding of what was happening and why. Helps us move away from the focus on human failure to understand not that the human has failed, but why and how the system set them up for that failure. It's really important to remember this, that error is a symptom, not a cause, and it's the job of a safety investigator to go and look for what those why there are symptoms and what the influencing factors are within the system there. We need to listen and inquire with humility, and as best we can, be an empath, listen and absorb. They were there that night, we weren't. We don't want to do any further harm. They've already been harmed. They've already been upset that there's been a near miss on the aircraft, that the aircraft has departed and the nose wheel has come away, or the aircraft has departed and an access panel has flown off, or worse. People will already be feeling guilty and feeling upset. So we need to listen and inquire with humility, treat them like the field experts they are. And also, what's really important is to try and understand where they were looking at the time. Where was their focus of attention? Were they looking left? Were they looking right? And try and understand their local rationality. In other words, what was it in the local conditions that led them to those decisions and actions? And then last but not least, explore and promote proper human factors. Proper human factors isn't just about somebody who's careless or complacent. If we find that, then what is it in the system that's led to carelessness or complacency? These are labels that are not fair and not fit for purpose in themselves. If we find that we're using or engaging in blame language, we're not asking the right questions. If complacency is present, as Todd Conklin says, this is an indicator or a symptom of a stable system. We need to design the tasks better for humans and make things better and more fit for purpose for those involved. So some useful and potentially interesting references. So first shout is to the Todd Conklin Pre-Accident Investigation podcast. They are brilliant. Some of them are 3 minutes long. Some of them are about 25 minutes. Very, very good. Decker's Field Guide to Human Error is excellent. And then there's some other bits and pieces and references in there. If you've never come across the work of David Proven, really definitely worth listening to. This to the Bottom Safety Work podcast is really useful because it talks about the bias that I've had as an investigator. I must hold my hand up and confess, and how that leaches out into our reports, which then affects the recommendations and affects the people who've already been affected. They've already, felt bad about what's gone wrong, and we want to move away from that and learn from the systems-based approach how we can better understand what has happened and why, so we can have a much better chance of making improvements to make sustainable, positive safety change for prevention of future issues as best we can. So that, lovely people, is the end of my official slide set. So very many thanks for having me along for this. Are there any questions or any comments at all? Oh,
Thank you so
thank you,
much,
Catherine.
Jenny,
That's a
for
really good
this
point.
talk.
Sorry,
Thank you
I'm
so
just
much,
catching
Jenny.
it with the chat box. Sorry.
Yeah. No, I just wanted to say thank you so much for the presentation. What a wonderful talk. I have a question of my own, and then I'll ask Phil to repeat his question from earlier for the people who were not here before we started, and then I'll turn it over to the audience. But my question is on the CP test kind of process that you mentioned, and can you use this kind of approach to get at factors that are not just, you know, with the humans involved on the day of the accident, but that were involved in some of these higher levels that contributed to it in the end? For example, if you find that some of the standards were not fit for purpose, can you use this same approach to understand of the people that wrote the standards or the organizations that were involved in the creation of those standards, how we got to that point and what information they had and what controls existed on them to make sure that the standards were appropriate in the first place? How do you get at those higher levels?
So this is a great question. So taking a learning team approach or operational learning review approach, what you can do is go back and round a team huddle. You could say, okay, what is our problem statement? And we could say, okay, we're not looking at an accident. We're just looking at the fact that we've produced a procedure that we know people can't comply with or they're struggling to comply with. And let's explore this. And then you can take this and have those conversations. Okay, so let's look at the person element. Who was it who was involved in the design of those procedures? Okay, so let's take me as an example of this. I was designing a rota procedure to replace a fuel pump on an A380, having never done that before. I had done it on other aircraft, but not on an A380. So there was an underlying assumption in there from the organisation that I was qualified to do that, and actually I wasn't. But I took the task on, so we could have those interactions shown in there. One of the issues I had was that I'd never seen the task done itself. So actually the observation of the task happening in situ would have been really helpful. Watching people who were qualified and experienced to do this, to see the difficulties that they faced. What also would have been useful is to look at the standards and policies that were in existence and how these were affected them and what was the underlying training. So with anything really, you can take a problem statement and just explore all the different buckets. So where was I when I was designing that procedure? Well, actually, I was in the organizational factor was I was working for a manufacturer at a time, a designer at a time. I was in an office. I was nowhere near the hangar where the aircraft was. That was 200 miles away, something like this. So you can start to explore all these things using these buckets. And some of the human factors sessions I do for various organizations, I'll just throw people in and I'll just say, right, pick a problem statement in your organization. And it can be anything. It can be issues from car parking to people turning up late. So I did this recently in a hospital. And one of the biggest issues they have was what's called DNA, not what we think it is, but do not attend, people not attending appointments. And it was amazing just taking this approach, what they came out with. So this can be applied for, senior management problems through to things that affecting car parking issues through to, things in investigations. So it can be applied, and I've seen it applied well just for conversations and operational learning reviews.
Great, thank you. Phil, I'll turn it to you for your question.
Yeah, I guess so my question is, a great deal of my work when I was in aerospace human factors was to analyze prospective human error, pilot error. So it's at design time when you design your aircraft or your avionics system, the regulation now asks us to do this prospective human error analysis. So what error could the pilot do, and then what will be the impact on the aircraft? And those methods are all task-based, meaning that you take a checklist and you just go through step by step, and for each step, well, the pilot could not do the action or push the wrong button, this kind of stuff. And I think it has a very narrow view as to the actual error that happened in accident, but it's a perspective because there's no way for you to test. You just try to ask yourself what could go wrong and then what could happen. So I was just curious, how would a system-based approach help us to this
Again,
kind of
I think,
activity?
no, this is a great question. Thank you. And I feel your pain because it's slightly different approach I had to take. So I would sit with my where I used to work. We had a fleet of 1,100 aircraft when I worked at BAE Systems, and we get safety reports. And part of what I had to do, one of the elements was to try and look at the different error types in there without the richness of the data that I get from having the conversations with those, with the members of the flight crew or whoever was involved. And I think this is where we can have those richer conversations if we actually speak to a range of sample end users, and we can actually observe them doing the task and talk, ask, watch what's happening and have those conversations with them. So what might be a problem for you here? Talk me through the issues that you're finding in this sense. Tell me what you're observing. Tell me where your attention is being pulled. And I think having, again, that wide open approach in terms of wide open questions, TED-T, tell me, explain, describe, talk me through, coupled with this type of systems-based approach, I think will give us more information, because sometimes if it's just paper-based, it's tricky. We lose, again, that richness of what people are thinking or where they're drawn to. I suppose another way of doing this really well, there's some excellent work from Professor or Dr. Steve Jarvis, where he uses a lot of eye tracking and then gets the descriptions from the pilot. So they're self-assessing workload using, I think it's NASA TLX, or he's got a various different ways he approaches depending on what his problem is he's looking at. And then he has conversations with people afterwards, depending on the scenario, depending on the aircraft, depending on the project. So he'll look at a few different modes. But I think, again, with real humans and having real conversations, I think this is a really, to me, it's the most useful way. It's far more time consuming, but I think you can get more data out.
Yeah, I think, I definitely understand. So if you look at the recommended practice by GAMA, so the General Aviation Manufacturer Association, it's paper-based. And they only ask you to verify your assumptions if you're unsure about the consequences, at which time you could actually go in the sim to verify whether your assumption were good or not. So, but yeah, I really take it as having more of an empirical approach to be able to understand how people do their stuff and how they adjust their work for safety, I guess.
Yeah, and that's a lovely phrase. I'm going to steal that. Adjusting your work for safety. I'm going to steal that. Thank you, because that's what they're doing. They're doing that daily, aren't they? So yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Jenny. Thanks, Phil. Any more questions from anybody in the audience? Feel free to either leave them in the chat or unmute and ask away. I guess I can ask one more if nobody in the audience has questions. I like to ask for our kind of younger members or people who are early in their career getting into this field, what do you recommend as, well, you've already showed some resources, but what do you recommend people do if they're interested in this field and want to get to the level that you are in investigating accidents and integrating human factors into these approaches?
Yeah, a great question. I think if you can get some, it depends on your background. I suppose if you've come through the engineering route, or engineering then human factors, or pure human factors, I think whichever route I suppose you've come through, I think experience frontline in an airline is really useful, or anywhere, airfield based. So trying to work with aircraft if you want to particularly get into the aircraft side of things, I think is great. So you get so much information and so much learning from all of that type of thing. And within airlines, and also within air traffic, within ground handlers, within maintenance organizations, they will have safety teams that will have to do a level of investigation. So this is often probably an easier way to get into safety investigation, rather than trying to sign up to the NTSB. But the NTSB have taken people on who have been safety managers and safety investigators within different organizations. I think they've taken people on from Boeing, who've worked for manufacturers, who've worked within airlines as well. So there's a few different options in there, but I think getting some actual frontline safety experience within an air-based organization can be really useful, whether that's commercial or whether that's military, because again, in military there's safety investigation roles too.
Awesome, thank you. Last chance for anybody in the audience to ask any questions. All right. Well, Jenny, do you have any closing remarks you'd like to make?
I just want to say huge thanks for your time. Thank you for coming along today. And I can imagine that you're all very busy, but it's been a pleasure to be here. I think one thing I would recommend is try from here on in, if you can, watch out for headlines you might see in the press. Look out for things in the media, and maybe if you can pick up the odd NTSB report here or there. There's some great examples of good human factors analysis in there. But sometimes some of the headlines and sometimes probable causes are, I think, sometimes reductionist. So look out and see what's around, and hopefully you might start to get some of the frustrations I get when I see the one-liners as cause, pilot error, failure to follow procedures, because it doesn't really get into the why. So always look for what happened and, really importantly, the why in here. And with that in mind, we can hopefully make safety better, and try and reduce harm. So that's my final point, and that's a thank you. I was just seeing
Thank
what
you.
Catherine
Those
said. Thank
were
you. Sorry, I've just seen some things that have you implemented resilience, such as so yeah, Viviana, Fram, I've had a go at. I'm probably not as intelligent as many of you are, so I find it probably a little bit trickier. So it's not something that I regularly use, but I have used it in the past. And Catherine's saying, can you mention the importance of boundary issues between disciplines, for systems thinking? Catherine, do you mean boundaries between different organisations?
So I mean that you make a decision in one part and then you roll the risk into another part. So being aware of the permeability between, say, pilots, air traffic controllers, you roll the risk, you think you fixed it in one place. And then by really systems thinking from an aviation perspective, then how do you, it's really important to sort of, as what Philippe said, is not just to think about that individual component. We're not 10 to the -9 of aircraft
Yeah,
manufacturer. We are actually having that integration so that we can make it easy for people to do the right thing. And quite
absolutely.
often, our specialisms we are so into that we end up then going, well, this fixes it here, but we haven't considered how that then rolls down. So I think
Yeah,
that's an important way of how you've introduced us as well to the subject. Obviously,
it's
I'm a big
sorry.
ICAO person because I was part of the writing group, but um, but yeah, you made it really simple for us to take those first steps for people who hadn't had that, and to start thinking in a much more systemic way. So I just wanted to highlight that bit.
I know. I think this is, yeah, hugely important. I think that it's very easy, as you say, to sit in a silo, and that's why. So one thing, if I can just write in the chat box, in terms of a so if with more time we go into how we do analysis and how we do findings, and how those findings should outline the risk across potentially across boundaries. And just yesterday I was in with it's outside of aviation with the Royal College of Obstetrics and Gynecology, and we talked about how we write recommendations that aren't just smart but think about the wider knock-on effects here. So is it how far does it fix the risk in this area, and how far does it have a knock-on effect in other areas? And so there's lots of examples where I'll just give you one, if I may, from construction. So about 20 odd years ago, there was a requirement in new buildings in the UK, be they apartments or houses, to control the spread of fire. They put spring-loaded doors into kitchens, and that became a mandatory requirement for houses. Lovely idea. But the knock-on effect of that was that we had more children presenting in ED, in emergency departments, because of fingers being trapped. Kids love playing with doors. It was something that wasn't thought about. So when we talk about the end users in terms of recommendations, I often say this, and this is one of the things I brought up yesterday as well. VSMA, we need to have in there. We need to have our verb in there. It needs to be specific to the finding, essentially what the risk is in that finding. It needs to be measurable. I'm just writing this in the chat box, so forgive me typing at really slow speed. The users or those affected all consulted. So if you're doing something per pilots, lovely, but what's the knock-on effect to engineers who have to then change this system and maintain it. So we're not just thinking of operability. So the boundaries that Catherine's talking about, we're thinking about maintainability as well. So all consulted the sample range of them. And then the final one in there is realistic in managing the risk. And without having this sort of VSMA approach, it's not really great. So I know often we talk about recommendations and how they can help us, but the main thing is, I'm just going to move my, excuse me one sec. There we go. I'll put that in the chat box now. This is, I think, one thing in SMART, which some of you may have heard about for your objectives with your studies or anything you're doing work, setting objectives for your appraisals and things, specific, measurable, achievable, and so on. This adaptation I've just put in the chat box there does account for those end users. So safety change or recommendations should be done with people, not to people. So doing something for aircrew will have a knock-on effect in maintenance, particularly if it's a kit change or something like that. So it's making sure that everyone is brought along in that sense. So defining who, in human factors, we think of TAD, don't we, the target audience description. That change might be affecting them directly, but what about the other people around it? So this is a great point. So Catherine, thanks so much for raising this. Are there any other questions? Because this is a brilliant one. Any more? Keep them coming, because this is great. It's got me really thinking now. Any more comments or questions or banter?
I'm going to become a lady now.
Brilliant. Oh, it's great, Catherine. It's honestly, it's really good. It works about 60 or 70% of the time. It does. It's amazing. I had a cheapo room in London, and I just booked it on you know, wherever it was, TripAdvisor or whatever, through their booking. And I rang up and said, "Oh, hello. It's because my name was, yeah, I put Lady in when I booked it. I said, it's Lady Jennifer. Any chance of a nice upgrade?" And I got a room with a view of the beautiful Shard in central London for no extra cost. So bonus. So yeah, it's a gift that keeps on giving. Unfortunately, it can't go on my passport, but it's, you know, it is a legal title. So yeah, tip from there. So thank you. Oh, Megan, thank you for your comments.
Lots
Very
of
lovely of
great
you today.
advice.
Thank you.
Lots of
Awesome
great
stuff.
advice. Thank you so much, Jenny, for this talk. As I said at the beginning, if anybody in the audience is interested in participating in any of these or knows somebody, please reach out to me. Nothing else from me, so thanks so much, Jenny, and we will come back for another webinar, hopefully in a month.
Excellent. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you all for being here, and thanks for your questions and your participation. And take care, fabulous people. All right, all the best. Thank you again.
Thanks.
Thank you. All the
Bye.
best. Bye.